Welcome back. You're watching Hope TV News Watch. Now, that story by Alice Diana just before the break gives us a perspective of what you're going to discuss today about the demonstrations. We saw Azimio calling off the demonstrations yesterday, and it seems that there is sobriety in the political scene. And tonight, as I earlier promised you, we'll be having George Ogubi, who is a constitutional lawyer, to help us dissect this whole issue. Karibu sana wakili.
Thank you very much, Kennedy.
Yes. So Article 37 of the Constitution, and let me read it, it says, every person has the right, peaceably and unarmed, to assemble, to demonstrate, to picket, and to present petitions to public authorities in layman's term. Do the words assemble, demonstrate, and picket have different meanings?
Well, allow me first of all to appreciate that in the last 2 weeks, that provision of the Constitution has been put to test, where we have several actors and several players when it comes to this right under Article 37. And even before I look at Article 37, I will refer you back to Article 19 of the Constitution. And when you look at the provisions of Article 19, then you understand why we have provisions such as Article 37. Because Article 19 says that fundamental rights and freedoms belong to each individual, and they are not granted by the state. And so when you come back now to Article 37, which now gives the provision for assemble, demonstrate, picket, and of course, they elicit different meanings, because you can assemble and not demonstrate. You can decide perhaps just to assemble, like the barazas. We've seen several barazas happening in town. Prominently, one was happening, I think, here at Kamukunji grounds, where they were calling themselves Bunge la Wananchi, just to discuss some of the issues that are affecting the common Mwananchi and Kenyans by large. And of course, demonstrate, now that is when you see a lot of movements where, now crossing into the cities, into the towns, into the, the homes where people stay, so that they express themselves. And of course, now we have those other rights that emanate from that Article 37. But by and large, all these have got different meanings, and Kenyans in the last 2 weeks chose to exercise that right under the provision of Article 37.
So how about picketing?
Picketing is where, like, for example, you see carrying placards, like even issuing of, like carrying placards, talking and trying to elicit reactions from the respective authorities. In this situation, for the last 2 weeks, it was the government. So I think that is how I'd look at it under Article 37.
All right, so let's look at the role of the state in demonstrations. We saw the government declaring the demonstrations as illegal, despite even Azimio having notified the police about the protest. I mean, what is the role of the state in ensuring that Kenyans do peaceful demonstrations?
It was surprising, number one, to hear that when a notice has been given in exercise of Article 37, it was surprising to see the police say that they cannot hold those demonstrations and that those demonstrations are illegal. It was very surprising. Looking at the wordings of Article 37, not even the state can limit that right. Every Kenyan has got a right to demonstrate. And when you clearly examine the provisions of Article 37, there are those words, 2 words that have been used in that article, which we call internal qualifiers, when it says about peaceful and unarmed, so that if you are an individual or in a group of persons, you are supposed to demonstrate, picket, assemble in a peaceful way, and when you are not armed, when you are unarmed. So if at all the state is supposed to play any role when it comes to these demonstrations, it's only when they are now enforcing those, what I've called internal qualifiers to that right to demonstrate, picket, such that if I am going to demonstrate and I am not peaceful and I am armed, at that point the state, of course, through the National Police Service, can come in. But this duty is on the police to identify either individual persons or individuals who are perhaps not peaceful and are armed. And at that point, now the state, through the police, can come. But issuing an order declaring that a notice which was issued for demonstration is illegal, for me, that was uncalled for and very surprising to have seen that, because you cannot limit that right in that particular way.
Talking about limiting of rights, so the Interior CS actually proposing to change the Public Order Act through Parliament, and the proposal includes limiting the number of people who organize and participate in protest, and ensuring that organizers pay for any property destruction. Also, those participating in demonstrations will also be required to give their consent for organization of a protest and provide the number of hours and routes to be used. I mean, what are the implications of this?
I mean, that law is uncalled for. Personally, coming from a human rights perspective, I think that is a law aimed at creating a lot of limitations around that article. And I don't believe the framers of the Constitution perhaps envisaged or thought that they would want to limit the number of people or persons who would attend demonstrations. Like, for example, I would say like the media fraternity issued a notice to go on strike, I think on Wednesday or something. So if this law, and unfortunately or through unorthodox means it happens to become light, what then are the implications? So that if media people are 1,000 in this country, then you have a law that says only 100. What then happens to the rest of the 900 who would want to participate in that demonstrations? You cannot limit that right in that sense. And I believe that proposal by the CS is not proper. And perhaps those that are advising could do better in terms of trying to limit that right under Article 37.
Well, some may argue that they have the right to demonstrate, but it may limit other people's rights. You know, maybe, for example, on Mondays and Thursdays when there were demonstrations, there are some people who had businesses, but they could not open because of the fear that came with, you know, there are some people who used to hide in the demonstrations, but they're just hiding to steal from people, to destroy property. I mean, some may argue that, yes, you have the right, but I'm limited to do some other things in life, and you are also getting into my own rights.
Of course, fundamental human rights and freedoms demand that your right ends where mine begins. That is usually the principle. And when I was dissecting Article 37, and I looked at the internal qualifiers, what legally are called internal, the content of Article 37 is such that those wanting to participate in these demonstrations, picketing or otherwise, then they have to conduct themselves in two ways. They have to be peaceful and they have to be unarmed. The minute somebody participates in that assembly or demonstration and they are not peaceful and they are armed, then at that point the police have to come in. The problem is the law has put the burden on the police so that it is the police work to identify both civilians and even police who conduct themselves in an unpeaceful way and they are armed. Because there are several High Court decisions, especially on how the police should conduct themselves when it comes to, when it comes to them supervising or perhaps watching over demonstrations. If they are supposed to use force, that force has to be proportional. And that is why there are issues around rubber bullets. They are not supposed to use live bullets. But what we saw in these last 2 weeks, there were instances where live bullets were being used against demonstrators who were allegedly thought to have been unpeaceful and probably armed in one way or another. So that was uncalled for. The High Court decisions have been very clear that police are supposed to use proportional force. And if they use excessive force, it has to be when they are perhaps self-defense or when they are protecting life, both of the demonstrator or perhaps the person who in this situation or in this circumstance becomes a victim. So those are some of the highlights and those are some of the things that you need to look at. And I believe a lot needs to go in terms of talking about the use of force when it comes to some of these events like demonstrations, like what we saw against the media, the attacks against the media, either as an individual or as a group. Nothing can justify use of such excessive force in such a circumstance.
Actually, many have argued that if the police were not involved in using force, the demonstrations will have been peaceful. We will not have witnessed what you saw with many people injured, more so journalists. Do you think that's the case?
When you look at it, the argument can be in two ways. Yes, if the police would have just restrained, because there are those regions where we saw the police really didn't have much to do, and even in some towns, even in some circumstances, you could see police even laughing with members of the public, and so when you see such kind of happenings, it tells you that really demonstrations in this country can happen without any form of violence meted towards civilians, towards the police, or towards any other person who is involved in that demonstrations, including the demonstrators themselves. So it is possible to achieve that, and it is indeed true. And the videos you could see circulating in on media houses, you see, you could just see a group of people walking and approaching the police, and when they are almost getting to where the police are, you could see the water cannons, the tear gas being fired at them, and at that point you ask yourself a question: were they really unpeaceful? Were they really armed for them to get such kind of reactions from the police? And on the other hand, you could see videos of people who are carrying stones and everything. So you could say at that point, perhaps the police were doing a self-defense, perhaps to protect themselves or to protect life. In any case, life was threatened at that point. So
there's this picture of this police who really trended on social media, who was actually tear gassing, if I can put it in that term, a vehicle which was believed to have journalists of the Azimio brigade inside there. I mean, can people take legal action against the police, and how can one go about that?
I mean, definitely, I saw that video, and I would say I was disturbed by the scenes in that video. Even in a normal circumstance where a police would want to arrest somebody or would want to use force against somebody, either perhaps to enforce an arrest warrant or something, you do not see such kind of treatment. It is uncalled for, where you see a police officer bluntly just breaking glass windows of a car. That was uncalled for. That was not proportional force as per the High Court decisions. And perhaps because of the truce that was brokered yesterday, much action might not be taken against it. But we sit down and say that particular individual, particular police officer needs to be brought to book, so that whatever he did should, I speak against it in the strongest terms possible, that was use of unproportional force towards a media person, towards a civilian, or towards any other person who was participating in that demonstration.
Sure. And the other day we saw the police releasing, what is it called? The police say that they'll no longer release information on deaths, injuries, and damage to property arising from the ongoing anti-government protests. And amazingly, that the protests were ended yesterday, were called off. In the future, do you think that this will have any implication, not releasing information on deaths, injuries, and damage to property?
Well, I will remind you that there is a provision in the Constitution that talks about right to information. If it is their duty, or perhaps any other Kenyan would want to access such kind of information, which is being held by the state, then the state is obliged at that time to release such kind of information. Whether you can limit that right, of course the limitations are provided for, again in the same Constitution, I believe under Article 24, where you look at matters of national security, matters of public interest, and so on and so forth. So if at all that right is supposed to be limited, then it has to fall within the ambience of Article 24, where we talk about the three-part test, such that if I want to limit a right, it has to be provided. That limitation has to be provided for by law. That limitation has to be necessary, and of course, when you talk about issues of national security. So I don't really believe that it would be a good move, because now there's that provision about right to information.
Sure. As we conclude, many have argued that political demonstrations can never be peaceful as much. do you subscribe to the line of thinking? Because many people take advantage of these demonstrations. In as much as we call them peaceful, there's someone just to come and steal and do all sorts of vices.
Well, I will remind you of the saying that says that in every market there must be a madman. But is it possible to achieve peaceful demonstrations? Yes, it is possible. We have seen them in other countries where people have demonstrated peacefully without really, destroying property and the rest. When these demonstrations were announced, you remember that 3 other countries in Africa reported, also announced that they will have the demonstrations. You will realize that you've not seen distractions. People can just walk on the streets, demonstrate, raise their grievances without harming, your colleague or your neighbor. So it is possible to achieve a violent, free demonstration, and it is possible to, raise your grievances towards the government. But as I've said, in every market, there must be a madman, and there are those who will want to come out and perhaps spoil what had been started.
Sure. Do you think with the calling off of the demonstrations, we are seeing some truce, some political sobriety, and that we are going to have a solution to whatever is ailing the country, be it in tough economic times, electoral reforms?
Well, I've seen many people asking that question, but whether truce was found or not, it's a matter that should be seen in the coming days. But I will refer you back to the statement by the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga when he addressed the nation yesterday, and he seemed to have put a temporary hold to the demonstration. He didn't seem to have given it that complete quietness. He seemed to have given it a temporary, what legally we would call a temporary stay of proceedings. So he seems to have halted it for now, waiting to see what will happen in the coming days. We have seen some instructions that were given to both speakers of the houses today in terms of having the bipartisan approach. So perhaps the deal that was brokered, we are now seeing it in motion now. But whether it will go up to its logical conclusion, again, it's a matter of days. And we will see whether now the opposition led by the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga will now come up in arms again, or they will be satisfied with what the government would have done up to that particular point. Probably they agreed on a timeline on how to achieve some of these grievances that were being raised.
In your own opinion, do you think using the parliament will solve the issues, keeping in mind that Kenya Kwanza government has the majority in both houses?
That is again the beauty of democracy. And we'll want to see both the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga and, of course, His Excellency the President, Dr. William Ruto, marshal up their troops when these things come up in Parliament, whether either as an act of Parliament or through policy making. We'll want to see. It will be very interesting. And, of course, what would also be interesting to watch is the fact that some members of Parliament had already shifted camp in one direction or the other. Others moved to support Azimio, others moved to support Kenya Kwanza. With the truce that was brokered yesterday, I want to believe some of these things will be very difficult for them in terms of balancing now to get the truce that was brokered yesterday.
So it might be a bit difficult.
Very difficult. But we want to see how His Excellency the President will marshal up his numbers. Of course, as it stands, he seems to be enjoying a comfortable number in both houses, and of course Odinga also has got his troops in both houses. So it will be very interesting to see how this will play out in both houses. But we expect that democracy, the rule of law, as the President says, that it will prevail.
Sure. And
we want to see Kenyans being victors in all this.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time. That has been George Ogubi, a constitutional lawyer, helping us dissect Article 37 of the Constitution. All right, from that point, now go to a short news break. I'll be back with more news. See you on the other side.